Well, we had a couple big reports out today. We had the quarterly grain stocks report and the prospective plantings report. We're going to talk about the grain stocks first. Randy, what do you want to say about the grain stocks?
It really wasn't much of a report. I mean, when you look at the grain stocks, I mean, USDA per the average trade estimates were pretty close to what was expected. We came in a little bit less on the corn stocks, a little bit more for soybeans, a little bit more for wheat. But in the big picture, it was pretty close to expectations, which shows that the demand numbers that USDA has been reporting have been pretty close to being spot on with the supply and demand estimates. So for right now, not looking at any big changes as far as demand is concerned in the reports that'll come out here in April. What everybody's going to be watching now is what USDA starts coming with in May with the new crop numbers.
And I've got some charts on the stocks. Do you want to go over these at all or just keep moving on?
The only thing I'll mention here is you just look at what's being held, on farm and off farm. You look at the breakdown as far as on farm for wheat. I believe most of it is sitting in the commercial storage yet, and that's been kind of what we've been seeing as kind of the consensus for wheat, all year long.
And that's just over the last 10 years for corn. That's where we are.
And there, on farm is still holding a majority of the stocks, but it's getting closer. It's almost getting to be 50-50, which we've been 2/3 on farm, 1/3 off farm. So that's starting to tighten up, which just tells us that farmers are moving the product.
And then looking at this, I would assume this is a record then for March stocks. We only go back 10 years, but
I bet, yeah, it's the record for us. I mean, the record production, so it kind of falls into play that, yeah, we'll be looking at a record amount of stocks being held.
For soybeans, that's where we sit with that.
And again, that's pretty close to 50-50 as far as on farm, off farm. And that's been kind of the just like wheat, what we've been seeing most of the year.
And again, not a record there. But yeah, that was kind of a non-event. Moving on, though, to the big one, which was the prospective plantings one. Overall, the numbers went where we did, but it was, I think the swings were more than expected.
I think that's right. I mean, everybody was expecting to see less corn acres, and USDA, for some reason, doesn't want to be friendly corn, or they just are looking at producers wanting to plant corn because of the profitability. And a lot of this was done before March 1, a lot of it before the fertilizer prices and the fuel prices shot up. So we are looking at over the average estimates of close to 1 million more acres of corn expected to be planted. From the previous year, we're down almost 3.5 million. So not as big of a cut as anticipated. On the flip side, soybeans are not as many acres as expected. So they're actually looking at that million, close to that million, being more into corn and less than the soybeans. But soybeans are up for the acres overall. The surprise came in wheat, where all wheat acres dropped by close to 1 million, 1.5 million from the previous year. And some of that came from a reduction in the winter wheat acres, as Oklahoma was the biggest one that saw the biggest increase that we saw in January's numbers. This was now where they saw the biggest decrease. As far as spring wheat, I think this will be the largest acreage number we see for the year. And also, I believe this is the largest corn acreage we'll see for the year. But it does show that we are looking at about a 6 to 8% decline as far as spring wheat acres are concerned.
Go through some charts here. Principal crop acres are dropping again in most states. The principal crop acres are everything in that blue box, which is pretty much everything we grow. But that's where we sit with acres. So we've got acres declining for the third year in a row now.
And that's kind of interesting, that, in 23, we were looking at, 319 million principal crop acres. We're down 9.5 million acres since then. And a lot of it is, where are these acres going? And that seems to be the biggest question. That's something that we're going to have to do some digging into. But for right now, it does show that we are seeing acreage disappear as far as the U.S. is concerned.
And again, this is state by state, and pretty much everyone is seeing lower acres planted this year.
By quite a bit. You know, you looked at last year, North Dakota was the state that planted the most into principal crops. This year, we've given up that throne, and Iowa now is taking over. So it's between U.S. or the North Dakota and Iowa, usually on a consistent basis. Iowa's beating us out this year.
Looking at corn again, they expect Kansas to have higher acres. All the other big states will be lower. And again, corn acres a little bit more erratic than the wheat numbers we saw. And again, this, I assume, isn't surprising to you since we saw the drop in corn acres nationwide.
Right. And you can see that, you know, a lot of them that went heavy corn last year are going back into soybeans this year, just on a crop rotation basis. And that is very visible when you look at this chart.
We move on to soybeans. Now, again, all the major states, North Dakota is one of the top 5, all seeing increases. If we look at the chart or the map for that, that's where we sit for acres. And then again, when you look at the map, we got the opposite here. Most states seeing an increase.
And what's interesting is looking at, you know, like some of the Delta areas are switching out of soybeans. I'm not sure quite what they're going into. But then also Ohio and Wisconsin seeing a switch out of soybeans, which is kind of interesting.
And then if we throw corn and soybeans together, again, principal crop acres were dropping in a lot of states. So still we're seeing overall combined corn and soybean acres dropping in pretty much all the Midwest.
In all the Midwest, the major corn belt areas. So, I mean, that's kind of interesting because that's kind of the bread and butter for that region. Only Indiana's seeing an increase.
Moving on to wheat, winter wheat. Again, acres there, there's just kind of remained static the last few years, some small decreases. Looking at the map for that, I think it was funny that North Dakota's winter wheat acres decreased by a whopping 35% of not a very big number.
Not a very big number. We do not plant a lot of winter wheat up here at all. And you can see there's a little bit more that's planted in Montana and even more in South Dakota, but we're still not very significant in the big picture.
Moving on to spring wheat, of course, North Dakota is the biggest spring wheat producer in the country, but all the big states seeing decreases except Minnesota's static. And this, you know, we look at this, we've been decreasing, 7 of the last 8 years from that 13.2 way back in 2018.
And you look at it, I mean, that's a big decrease in acres in that little bit of time. You know, in those 6 years, 8 years, we have slipped almost 4 million acres of spring wheat, which it sends the tone that wheat is not as profitable. And the quality issues have really forced a lot of producers away from that crop.
And again, expecting to see about an 8% drop in North Dakota acres, close to 10% in Minnesota. Durham, again, North Dakota is the main producer there. And Durham acres have not seen the slide that the spring wheat acres have.
They've seen, price has increased their acres the last couple of years, but now because of quality issues, we're seeing a pretty good sized pullback this year.
And again, not many Durham states. North Dakota's down 13% from last year. Then looking at the minor crops, anything stick out to you here?
I guess, not as a big surprise, but we are seeing canola acres up significantly. That's been a crop that's been growing in North Dakota, especially in northern Minnesota. Sunflower acres, because of the strong guarantee, not surprising that we're seeing those acres up. What surprised was the drop in dry edible beans, but because of the tariffs and because of the inability to ship product, I can understand those acres being down quite a bit. But overall, not huge surprises, a little bit more of a change than anticipated, but the directions were as expected.
And then looking at that from a percentage basis, we've got canola acres up 15% from last year, dry edible beans down about 10%. And then sunflowers up almost 8%. Then to wrap this all up, if we look at the principal crop acres, this is chart is by acres planted this year. And there you do see how corn and soybeans are just vastly outweighing everybody else there.
And the other big crop that most people don't anticipate or expect, hay. I mean, it's still the third largest crop grown in the U.S.
And I know that, and it still surprises me every time I see it on a chart. If we look at the planted acreage change from last year, of course, the biggest change, again, big swing, increased soybeans, decreased corn. But then right next to corn, though, is the winter wheat and the spring wheat in terms of acres. Oops. Hit the wrong button. The last slide I have is that if you look at it from a percentage change, canola's big winner in the nation, up 14.8%.
And you look at that, it's the oil seeds. The top three are oil seeds, which, with the biofuels and with the changes we're seeing in the renewable fuel standards, it stands to reason that those would be the ones that we're seeing the big increases.
And then, even though we had that big corn decrease in acres percentage-wise, it was, barely on the chart there of the crops that lost acres. Corn still is king at over 90 million acres. And like I said, I think that we'll still see a little bit of a drop by the time we get to June, but a lot of that will depend on what happens this spring. Anything you want to say to wrap this up? What are we looking at going forward here?
I would expect that, soybeans are going to continue to see some support. They'll still try to price in a little bit of this, especially with the Trump-Xi meeting still on the books for early May. We did see some movement as far as the war with Iran, which now sent the stock market sharply higher. The dollar's a little bit lower as we're wrapping up on the Tuesday session. So I would expect that, that's going to be a little bit of encouraging for the export side of things. And I think that's what kept corn higher. Crude oil, though, is down. That might spill over and cause a little bit of trouble for corn in the next few days. But overall, the report's out of the way. It wasn't a huge change. Now we're going to wait and see what USDA comes with in May as far as the first look at the supply and demand numbers for new crop.
Yep, and then we'll start seeing crop progress reports too once we get into April. So we'll be able to start watching those.
Right. We'll start those. We're seeing winter wheat conditions now, but then everything will start coming into play once we get into April 1, which next week.
Yep, next week. Yep, that's all we got. Any questions, of course, give us a call, give us a text, email. You know where to find us. Here's our contact info. And thank you for listening.
All right, thanks.